Well, Trump's victory raises some questions about messaging in the campaign, as you can imagine. Why were Republicans so much more effective with their message, at least to the extent that we saw this kind of victory? And what do Democrats need to do to fix their message and maybe even possibly their beliefs? Let's bring in Steve Caplan, adjunct professor at USC's Annenberg School for Communication Journalism. Thanks so much for coming back, Steve.
Always great to be with you.
And it's interesting because now we're on the other side of an election that we talked about a lot coming in, especially from a messaging standpoint. Yeah. And I suppose we start with the winner. To the winner go the spoils. That means your expertise. What did Trump message effectively? Because a lot of people were saying it's about economic anxiety, but he also had a lot of scattershot stuff to say, too, that was often race baiting.
Well, you sure did. And, you know, way back when, in the dark ages, when we sat together, feels like a year ago, it was probably just a couple months ago, we talked about this being a change election. Yeah. And we had that conversation, who could present a better argument for change. And along with them, the economic issues and some other messaging, I think Donald Trump probably scored a few more points on change. And Kamala Harris just couldn't get that Joe Biden challenge off her back. So as we're looking at this right now, it seems like he was able to connect heavier on those change messages.
Interesting on that point, Steve. Sorry to cut you off. Because it's this idea of, well, she is attached to the incumbency, and he often would say, well, Kamala says she's going to fix that. Just ask her, why didn't she do it over the last 4 years? Which may be unfair, because what can the VP really do? But obviously she is the VP and she's in the White House. Talk about it from the Kamala standpoint. I mean, that idea of we're not going back, which suggests change to some degree. It's implied, right? We're not going back, so it's a change from something. Why did that fall flat?
You know, I think we're really going to have to take a look at this election and study it and see if we're going to repeat these same kinds of elections moving forward. I mean, we saw really incendiary rhetoric, and we can call it extreme, not extremists, but extreme in its tone. And it didn't, frankly, repel certain segments. It attracted them, apparently. Kamala Harris played it pretty safe, pretty straightforward. Even when she tried to go to the harder rhetoric and messaging with Donald Trump, a lot of people pushed back on her. So we have to see if maybe that's a ongoing sort of thread that we'll see in these campaigns, this sort of really extreme rhetoric, which, as far as democracy goes, could be a challenge. We'll see.
Well, it's interesting because people thought that the extreme rhetoric, especially to the extent that it had some racial connotations or overtones, at least with the speakers at the MSG rally, of course, Donald Trump alluding to some of that as well, that would wind up feeding into what Democrats have said, demographics are destiny. That in the Obama era, we're just going to keep on getting people of color in addition to women and suburban voters, and the white men that support former President Trump, that's going to be a smaller base. But we saw potentially, according to exit polling, some erosion with Latino men as well. So there's this idea that maybe some of this Puerto Rico is an island of trash coming from the MSG rally didn't necessarily land the way people were banking on.
Yeah, I mean, I think most analysts, and I'll put myself in that camp, looked at that as traditionalists, I suppose, and said, wow, that is no way to close an election. And when you looked at some of the other fundamentals, with a massive advantage on spending on advertising as well as field organizing, you know, buses and busloads of folks here in LA going out to Arizona and Las Vegas, you would think that those fundamentals argued well for a good performance on election day. It clearly didn't happen.
Let's talk about exactly what you're talking about, the investment in the ground game, the door knocking, the sort of scripted, tight, precise, what some people say really effective campaign that Kamala Harris ran. She doesn't win. Former President Trump doesn't really have a ground game to speak of. There's lots of stories about an underinvestment, outsourcing, a mess of the door knocking, et cetera. And he does win. Now, is this about a new style of politics, a new kind of candidate, or just a singularity of Trump?
Yeah, I think we have to go to the last one. I think he is a unique, not a unicorn, but a unique personality who can thread all those needles at once and go on what would be not traditional Republican channels. Joe Rogan is a pro-choice, I believe, pro-marijuana, you know, pro-weed, and certainly not the traditional model of a conservative, but he was able to tap into that zeitgeist. And I think a lot of young people, and I'm hearing it, we're beginning to see, a lot of young men especially have felt connected with. They felt left aside. And the Democrats perhaps have not done a good job of speaking to this younger demographic, and they're going to have to figure out how to do that better.
We go back again, and a lot of people, a lot of Democrats in particular, are saying Kamala Harris ran a great campaign given what the hand she was dealt, essentially. Maybe if Biden had stepped out and there was a process and she had more time, or if some other candidate had more time, it'd be different. She had 107 days, and like I say, according to the old principles of campaigning, she did all the stuff she needed to do. But maybe she was too scripted, right? And is there something to learn there?
I do think, Democrats are going to have to take a few more chances. And I think that the idea that, you may go into a hostile territory and get smacked around a little bit is probably something that most campaign managers don't want to see happen. But I believe that voters right now are looking for something different. They're looking for change. They're looking for somebody who's ready to try something new. And apparently that's what worked.
Yeah, it's so interesting because another thing that Kamala Harris really trotted out there, we saw it at the Democratic National Convention, we saw it in the closing days while MSG rally was happening for Trump. We saw Beyonce, there's a Taylor Swift endorsement, Oprah speaks at the DNC. We're talking about celebrities. Usually that factor is higher on the Democratic side than Republican side. And everyone's always like, does a celebrity endorsement help? Taylor Swift might be different. Kamala Harris loses. What does it tell us about celebrity endorsement?
Well, I do think that in terms of packaging and the way that we produce, campaigns produce events, conventions, glitzy conventions with Oprah and all of that, while it makes for great TV and it's high level of production quality, it's not connecting with voters. Voters are, for whatever reason, feeling that it's not authentic. And I think authenticity is very important. The other point I'll make is that when we look at this data and we look at what's happening with especially non-college educated, lower income voters, they're not really feeling the elites.
Right.
And while Taylor Swift may be a down-home girl, she's still a billionaire. And Beyonce is certainly not somebody who's you sort of sit and have coffee with every day. So they may need to look at that and evaluate. But if you ask me, if I was asked, would I rather have Taylor Swift's endorsement or not? I think I'd rather have it. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that seems like the basic. It seems like the basic line. And so many of the polls leading into this election were suggesting that the working class voters were going to break, of course, for Republicans in some ways, and then non-college educated versus college educated. But those margins got juiced in a way that surprised people, that suggests the realignment. What did you see in terms of the demographics, the way they played out, and also compared to the polling leading into it?
Well, we had heard quite a bit from the Trump camp that they were going to be able to reach and engage African American and Latino men and young men generally. I think a lot of people from inside the campaign world felt that that was a stretch. They're low propensity voters. So it's a surprise. There are other surprises we really need to unpack. If voter turnout writ large was lower than 2020, which I've heard some indications slightly lower, then how did lower propensity voters become more engaged? It doesn't seem to add up, but we'll see. Okay,
so let's just do a quick down of what we learned here. So should Democrats take more risks and turn up in places that are less scripted and more off the cuff in the future?
I do think from a messaging standpoint, and I think that that would hopefully lift their idea that they're more populist sort of connected to the people. So yeah.
It's hard to conceive of a more popular celebrity than Oprah or Beyonce or Taylor Swift, but if one were there, should Democrats pursue that person's endorsement, or should they start to move away from the celebrity endorsements?
I think I would not say no to Oprah Winfrey still. I think styles make fights, okay? There's a saying in sports, styles make fights. Donald Trump is a very unusual combatant, so I'd have to hold that off to know who my opponent is, because it really just depends on the fight. But Donald Trump is an unusual, awkward fighter.
And that's so true. And we have to say, as always, I mean, the numbers said with the approval rating in the wrong track, a ham sandwich could have beat the incumbent if it was just based on the numbers. And so maybe it's also just that. I mean, it's one of the things.
She was fighting some pretty strong headwinds. The debate, though, showed styles make fights, and that didn't play well for Donald Trump. So I think it's just about who's out there, and we'll see who comes out there next.
Gosh, so fascinating.
A lot of introspection happening over at the Democratic headquarters.
That's a good message to end from a messenger. Thank you so much, Steve Caplan. Great to have you.
Always.
And hope to do some more of this.
You know it.
All right, brother. Thank you so much. Steve Caplan, give us a sense of the messaging of this election. I hope we all learned something. Someone call Oprah. See what she's up to. More coming up. Stay with us.